2 weeks ago, we focused in depth on qualitative data and qualitative thinking, and we discussed how, whereas quantitative is very focused on objective things, there is a level of depression, there is a number of hospitalizations, you either got supportive housing or you didn't. Whereas qualitative is focused more on subjective experience. It uses text or sound or video as its data source. And we sort of discussed this idea of coding and some other things. Today, we're going to spend in the second video a much more in-depth, try to get a much more in-depth understanding of what this process is so that you can critically appraise the quality of the process as is presented in the qualitative articles that you have. We're going to focus primarily on grounded theory, not because grounded theory is the only or even the most important. It's certainly the most commonly used in social work, but it is one way of looking at qualitative data among many, although they all share some basic similar elements that we're going to talk about today. In grounded theory, we attempt to start with a blank slate, and we discussed this concept of bracketing a couple weeks ago. The idea is that you sort of take what you think about the world, you put it out there for yourself. Often people will literally write down an essay of what they think this process is so they can know what their biases are, put that in front of you, and then go be as neutral as possible, not letting your biases filter in as much as possible. Go to a data source, get them to describe their experience, their beliefs, their whatever it is that you're investigating. And then you take that text or that audio or that video, you break it into smaller pieces, you label those pieces, you then go back to the text and go back and forth until you have what you think are the meaningful units, the chunks of that text that are important. You have them categorized in a certain way. You build a theory out of it, and then you go back to the text and see if those theories make sense relative to what the data says again. And that's a continuous iterative process by which we break the text into chunks, make meaning out of it, and then go back to the actual data, the actual interviews, and see if our theories make sense when we go back and we read the interview. So that's the general process of qualitative research. Qualitative research primarily uses data in the form of text. It can be transcribed audio interviews, or people can write things down. You can actually use audio interviews and not even transcribe them, or you could use video. There's any form of recorded media, whether it's textual, audio, or video, can be used in the process that we're about to describe. Back in the day, we really had to use text because we didn't have fast enough computers to use videos. But we're not back in the day, we're now, and video is everywhere and relatively easy, and so you see a lot more video work. But still, I would say the primary means of analysis is to take audio or video, transcribe it into a text, and then do the sausage-making process that we're about to describe. So again, the grounded theory basic process is that we generate some data in the form of a text. We read through the text. We then go back to the text, break it into meaning units, chunk those into groups that we code into various things, build those things back into some form of a theory, go back to the data, and rinse, wash, and repeat. Rinse, wash, and repeat, and do it over and over again until we feel comfortable with the way that we've coded the data and that we've captured all of the elements and that we haven't let our bias that we tried to bracket out get in the way too much. But let's dig into this question of coding a little bit more in depth. So the idea behind coding is that we're going to take some long narrative of text and we're going to break it into small units. And when you go to the articles, what you'll see is somebody describe a theme, and then they'll have some examples, some quotes of that theme. Those quotes are what we're calling coded data or meaning units or chunks or whatever the phrase is. They've extracted that text from those chunks of text from the underlying text. From the larger narrative that was presented by somebody. So we're taking what somebody said and we're breaking it into small units, and then we're categorizing those chunks of text using some form of coding procedure. Let's get a little bit more concrete.
For my concrete example, I'm going to use some text from a book on grounded theory. The person being interviewed is 37 years old. She has lupus, and she's talking about how lupus affects her view of herself, her relationship with others, and her interaction in the world. So here's the quote. If you have lupus, I mean, one day it's my liver, one day it's my joints, one day it's my head, and people are really thinking you're a hypochondriac if you keep complaining about different ailments. It's like you don't want to say anything because people are going to start thinking, you know, God, don't go near her at all. All she is complaining about this. And I think that's why I never say anything, because I feel like everything I have is related one way or another to the lupus. But most people don't know I have lupus. And even those that do are not going to believe that 10 different ailments are the same thing. And I don't want anybody saying, you know, that they don't want to come around me because I complain. So what we have here is a text, and we want to break the text into component parts. So those component parts would be something like the first sentence, or the first chunk. If you have lupus, I mean, one day it's my liver, one day it's my joint, one day it's my head. So we might identify this as theme number 1 of shifting symptoms. Then we move on in the text, and we would take this chunk, and it's like people really think you're a hypochondriac if you keep complaining about different ailments. So this would be theme 2. This would be images of self given by others. Continuing on in the text, we could identify a third theme from this quote. And I think that's why I never say anything, because I feel like everything I have is related in one way or another to the lupus, but most people don't know I have lupus, and even those that do are not going to believe that 10 different ailments are the same thing. So in this last one, she's trying to deal with these images that she believes others have about her. And so if we go through any text, we can find a lot of these chunks of things. We break all of the text into these chunks. We group them into these themes. We then figure out what the themes mean and flush out the nuance of the themes by looking across people. So we just have one quote here, but if we interviewed 10, 15, or 20 people, we would have a lot of discussions of avoiding stigma. And so we could really flesh out what avoiding stigma means across a wide range of people. The same thing with the other themes.
Now, when talking about coding, we can come to a text like the one we just read with some idea of what we want. That would be focus coding. So we might be looking for the role that stigma plays. Or we might be looking to how open or transparent people feel about how they want to talk about their disease. Or it might be about how she sees the disease within herself, how she organizes her symptoms and what meaning she makes out of those. So all of those could be things that we focus in on, and that would be called focus coding. But we could also take a very open stance, like we just did with reading that text and just going through and systematically picking out the elements, making them more generic, less specific to the person being interviewed, and more about the concepts that we want to investigate. So you're sort of drawing up from the text, you're making more generalized statements about what the text is saying, and then you try to draw lines between individuals to build some themes out of that text. One of the problems with doing qualitative work is that it's very subjective, and it's not hiding from its subjectivity. In quantitative work, we're often trying to pretend like subjectivity doesn't happen. We want to pretend to be very objective. We talk about the data says, and we use quirky phrases like that. But in qualitative work, you can never escape the fact that you are engaged in a subjective process. And that's why we try to bracket out, make what our pre-existing beliefs are transparent to us so that we can look for them in our interpretation of the text, and we can look for where the text disagrees with our interpretation. But there's always this struggle with trying to get yourself out of the way, and there's a number of techniques we can use to keep these pre-existing conditions from overly influencing our interpretation of the data. Now, one of the things is this bracketing approach that we talked about earlier. Another thing is to use memos, where you write down what you're seeing, how you're interpreting it, and you share it with your coworkers. And your coworkers, the people working on the project with you, do the same. And so then you begin to compare across each other How do you see things? How do I see things? And you use that conversation about the attempt to explicitly recognize what you're thinking about the text, compare it to others, and engage in a dialogue about it. So transparency through the form of memos is one of the critical ways in which we do that. Another way is this constant comparative method, whereas memos are about sharing with other people or making your beliefs explicit, we can also go, and these are not and or, we should do both of these. We should go back to the text and see if what we're saying makes sense in the context of the text. So you go through, you build all of these themes out of all of these categories that you derive from the meaning units, and then you go back to the text and you say, if I try to read this text with this set of themes in mind, does that make sense? And so that's this constant comparative method where you're constantly comparing what the structure you're building to the data that you have. And as you can see, this process takes a lot of time. It's very involved, and it's really challenging intellectually, much harder than doing good quantitative work, because good quantitative work is, you're pushing buttons on a computer. Good qualitative work is really about keeping control of your own expectations, your own desires, your own beliefs about the subject, really letting the data come forward and being honest with yourself about that. And that's a very hard process. There's a variety of other problems that may arise in the course of doing coding work. Coding can be too general. You can make things so generic that they're not that meaningful, and you're picking out things that are sort of mundane and don't really help shed light on the underlying thing that you're looking at. Identifying topics instead of actions or processes. So you can look too much for a set of themes or topics that you expect to see, and you just sort of label, oh, she's talking about health status. Well, yeah, but that's not what we're really getting at. We're trying to understand what she's doing, how she's thinking, the processes that she's going through in the case of the lupus example. And so you want to get under just labeling things from a topic point of view, health status, and get at the underlying issues associated with it. You can overlook how people construct their processes and actions, because what we really want to do is get at what they're doing, what they're thinking, how they're interpreting it, and you want to get out of your own way in doing that. And so sometimes we confuse our own sense of what's happening, and we put our own narrative on it, and we really want to keep that clear. That's that bracketing process again. We can code out of context. In terms of breaking things into meaning units, you can sort of lose sight of what the whole is. When we do that, you really want to stay fixed on on how those meaning units fit into the larger narrative. And that's why we do that constant comparative process, where we take what we say we think we see there, go back to the text and read through and see if that makes sense in the context of what we saw in the text. And then you can just use the codes to analyze instead of, to summarize instead of analyze. And what we really want to do is use the codes to build up a structure of meaning that helps make sense out of something. We really want it to be analytical and not just restating what people said in different words. So this week we worked on a few sausage making processes in the form of quantitative research discussing chi-squared, t-test, correlations, and multiple regression. And then we use the example of grounded theory to think in detail about how qualitative work gets its sausage made. And the thing about both of these is that these are not things that are easy to do. They're not things that are easy to interpret or read. And it will be some of the most challenging aspects of the work that you do in critically appraising articles. And I hope that what you get out of this is a sense of, on the quantitative side, what a p-value is, how to sort of interpret the difference between groups using p-values, and empower you to think beyond the p-value. The p-value is just an initial cutoff. And even if you don't have a super great understanding of the p-value, you can sort of say, is it above or below 0.05? And that's sort of the line that we're going to draw, and that you can do. But the most important thing, and this is what I really want to emphasize, is that there are magnitudes of the effect. There are sizes of the difference between the groups. And those are things that you can interpret. And that's not dependent on a very strong p-value. A p-value of less than 0.001 doesn't tell you whether that difference is important. It just tells you randomness isn't a good explanation for that difference. So I want you to get that concept down, and I hope that empowers you to take a more critical eye toward these results sections and not get so caught up in the details of p-values and blah, blah, blahs. When it comes to qualitative research, there is a very intricate, intimate process that goes on, and it's a process that requires both fully living in your subjectivity, not trying to avoid it, but also recognizing what your potential biases are. And I think when critically appraising the qualitative side of things, we want to see how systematic and rigorous the investigators are in keeping their own preconceived notions out of the data analysis, building a set of theories about it, and then using the data to illustrate what those theories are. And so I hope you have a sense of now a little bit more in-depth sense of what's going on that led to the creation of those results sections, so that you can now approach them from an informed stance.